Next up is Charla Basran. Charla is a Canadian marine biologist living in Húsavík. She just finished her PhD at the University of Iceland, focused on whale entanglement in fishing gear. She's also a project manager at the University of Iceland's Research Center in Húsavík and a scientific advisor at Ocean Missions. Charla has been passionate about whales her entire life and about finding the balance between human use of the ocean and all the creatures which live there. Charla's talk is focused on cetacean entanglement.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and Eva for having me here at the Whale Congress again. Today I'm going to talk briefly about something I've been doing as the last portion of my PhD project at the University of Iceland. Most of the work that I did was focused mainly on humpback whale entanglement here in Iceland, but then I took a step back and I looked a little bit at underreporting of cetacean bycatch using some global examples and seeing how this looks in different countries around the world. So first, just to tell you a little bit about how we defined this for the project. So bycatch, I was using the definition that it's catch of non-target species in fishing gear where they died or likely they were fatally injured. Whereas entanglement is the catch of a non-target individual where they likely escaped or released alive. It doesn't mean, unfortunately, that in some cases the whale didn't die at a later date, especially if they were released with gear still attached to the body. But if they were released alive and seemingly not very seriously injured, then it becomes an entanglement instead of bycatch. And it's a big problem. It's estimated over 300,000 cetaceans die or are seriously injured every year in fishing gear. And something that is interesting about it is that it is an issue for both odontocetes and mysticetes, so both toothed whales and baleen whales, even though they're quite different in the way that they live their lives and orient themselves in the water. But for both of them, of course, there's the issue of drowning and becoming bycatch, but there's also issues for injury and change in energy budget, especially for the large whales. If they are carrying gear for quite some time, it can be a big change in their energy budget and affect things like their migration or their ability to reproduce. And the question is always why? Why are they swimming into the nets? There's a few reasons why this is probably happening. One might be that the gear that is catching many whales, dolphins, and porpoises is set in murky water or it's set in low light water if it's deeper. These would be primarily gill nets, which are a big problem for cetaceans. Then it's also hypothesized that for the odontocetes that are using echolocation, the nets have low acoustic reflectivity. So this means that there's not a strong signal coming back when the whales are echolocating. Maybe not strong enough that they're realizing that there's something in front of them that could pose a danger. When it comes to baleen whales that are not echolocating, one of the theories is that the nets are just not making a lot of sound. And the baleen whales have very good hearing, and Emily was just talking about them communicating with each other, so they're using sound a lot. And it's thought that the nets aren't really making a lot of sound, and so they're not noticing that the nets are there. So when it comes to underreporting, so many countries, they are trying to have the fishers report whether or not this is happening. And it's because we need a clear understanding of why this is happening and how much it's happening in order to have more sustainable fishing. But even in countries where this is the law to report it, it's considered really rare to have good reporting. Also, then this is creating a need for having observer programs. So somebody needs to be paid to go on the boat and monitor what's going on to be sure that the reporting is accurate. But this costs a lot of money, and I found that the report from 2020 from NOAA in the US, it cost $79.5 million to observe 54 fisheries. So this is just not realistic to do this for fisheries all over the world with this amount of money that it's costing. But interestingly, right now there's a really strong push for better bycatch management because of the rule that the US is now enforcing in their Marine Mammal Protection Act. So in the act, basically they're saying that they will only start importing fish from fisheries that have proper marine mammal bycatch management. So they're having proper estimates of how much this is happening, and they're causing a low amount of death or serious injury to whales. So because of that, a lot of countries now are interested in how do we calculate how much this is happening, and then how do we try to fix it so that the US is not putting import bans on their fish products. So one of the first things that I wanted to look at is who actually has the law for this. And it turns out that, as far as I could find for many months, nobody had ever made this list before because it was very complicated to try to go through the laws of all the countries. But out of the top 30 countries with the largest fishing industries in the world, 12 of them for sure have cetacean bycatch reporting laws. So they differ a lot. For example, in Sweden and Finland, you only have to report if there's a harbor porpoise in your net. Of course, that's the most common thing that there would be. But Japan, then it's only if you catch a baleen whale. So if you catch a dolphin, if you catch a porpoise, if you catch a beaked whale, no, it's not in the report. They also differed a lot in what needs to go into the report. And sometimes it was very complicated and sometimes it was very simple. So do you just report everything? Do you report serious injuries? Do you report only deaths? And 9 of these 12 countries have an observer program to try to verify how much bycatch there is. But these are also differing quite a lot in terms especially of how much is covered, the percent of the fishing effort that is covered by the observers. So what I wanted to look at is in different countries, the difference between what the fishers are saying is happening in terms of bycatch versus what the observers are saying is happening. So you need a lot of things for that. Sorry for all the text, but basically you need the fisher logbook data, the raw data from the fishers, which I was able to get for the USA, New Zealand, Norway, and Iceland. You need a measure of the fishing effort. So I got that in a few different forms, but it didn't really matter for my purpose how the effort was measured, as long as I had a consistent measure of effort for each country. Then you need the same thing from the observers. You need everything that the observers saw and how much effort they covered. One of the problems with this, and the US being so complicated with so many fisheries and different fishing agencies, instead of getting the observer data directly, I use the stock assessment reports. So they're releasing stock assessment reports that tell you the average number of cetaceans that were bycaught per year based on 5-year time blocks. So for the US, I had to do something different, but ultimately in the end, I was coming up with the same sort of estimates that I could compare. So then I could statistically compare the difference between observer and fisher bycatch reporting. Just pooling it and looking at it as a very general picture, I was able to look at 3 broad gear categories: trawl, net, which had to include gillnet and seines because they weren't split in the US data that I received, and hook and line gears. And you could see that this is saying that the observer reported number, catch per unit effort, was these percents higher than the fisher reported calculated catch per unit effort. So, in net gear, which nets everybody knows is some of the most problems for catching cetaceans, the average was over 7,000%. But you can see that something in Iceland was really pulling that average up, and I'll show you now. So you can imagine there's a lot of numbers coming out of this, but I just highlighted in the green. This was the percent increase now broken down by the fisheries that I was able to look at in each country. And you can see what happened with the cod gill net in Iceland. Almost 27,000% increase between the two calculations. So it was massive. So there's something going on there. that should definitely be looked at in Iceland. Then you can just see, I'm just going to focus on the combination of all the years of data that were available. You can see that the years differ. Some years had to be excluded in New Zealand because there was no observer data for those years. And then for Iceland, before 2014 for the lumpfish and before 2016 for the cod, they did not have reliable data. So the years differ, but what doesn't differ is that almost everything, it was significantly different. The observer was significantly higher than the fisher reported. The only one where it wasn't was the lining, so like hook and line gear in New Zealand. And for myself and most of my project, I was particularly interested in what is going on with large whale entanglements and the reporting of that. So then I had to look at how much those individuals made up in the fisher, this is in the fisher reported. So you can see in New Zealand, 3%, USA 8.5%, Iceland 0.3%, and then you have Norway there, which was 37%. So in Norway, they only have the vessels that are larger than 15 meters that are required by law to report. And until I received this data from the government, they kind of believed that there was nothing in the reports, the Marine Research Institute. Then when I received it, they were very surprised. It was still a very low number of animals reported, but there was a lot of blue whale reports in there. At this point, there's no way to verify them, but it was really interesting also to the Marine Research Institute in Norway that they were reporting that they had some sort of interaction with blue whales on their fishing gear in Norway. Then, of course, as I mentioned, I looked mainly at humpback whales in Iceland. And I could tell from the data that I've collected before that this is very much underreported. So 15% of the questionnaire respondents that answered an anonymous questionnaire that I had distributed witnessed a humpback whale entanglement before. At the very, very, very minimum, I could calculate that there's at least one per year that is witnessed. And from calculating the entanglement rate based on scarring or raw injuries, like these pictures are showing here, the minimum entanglement rate was 2% per year of the population in Iceland. So that's 200 whales out of the population, roughly, the central North Atlantic population, that are being entangled every year. However, if you look at the fisher reported data from Iceland, there was one humpback whale reported between 2009 and 2019. So severely underreported, especially for large whales. And of course, always the question is, but is it happening in Iceland? Because I looked a lot at scarring and this type of thing to make estimates. But the answer is yes, we know it is happening in Iceland. Probably not all 200 of those whales a year are entangled specifically in Iceland, but we know that it's happening. So this is just some from within the last year. Dalvik, Langanes, in the East Fjords, and these are just ones that were reported to the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard responded because the whales were seriously entrapped in the gear and needed assistance. Then you'll see on the right, it says the Dominican Republic. This is just an interesting case that we're looking into now. So this is a Husavik whale that was seen in the Dominican Republic in February, and it has this green rope around the front of the whale, probably going through the mouth, most likely. And in the Dominican, they said they don't recognize this rope. So we're trying to investigate if we can figure out how well it matches with gear, in Iceland or some of the other Nordic countries, because we know that this is a whale that's been in Husavik before. So definitely they're being entangled in Iceland. It's not being reported, and we have the evidence from other sources. And of course, the question is also, why is it not being reported? And the obvious one is that there's concerns over negative consequences to the fishing. So it could end up that it changes the type of gear that they're allowed to use, or the time of the year that they're allowed to fish, or the area that they're allowed to fish in. And of course, they don't really want to volunteer this information, even though it's not voluntary, it's the law. But They don't really want people to know too much about this because then, of course, they're worried about what's going to happen to them, which makes sense. Also, some of the problem is definitely that there's unclear laws. So in the US, they have the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is very strong and has very clear rules, but it's very complicated when it comes to serious injuries. And how do you determine what a serious injury is? And there's a very long list of serious injuries that makes it complicated. And the more complicated you make it, the less likely that somebody's going to take the time to do it. When it comes to Norway, the law actually says they only have to report landed catch, and it says that it's not the law to land a cetacean. So how are they ever going to get reported if it's conflicting that way? And when it comes to Iceland, the law is actually really quite unclear. From my survey, I knew that the fishermen believed that they should only report something if they knew for sure it was dead and they caught it. However, if you ask the Marine Research Institute of Iceland to read the law, which I've done, and ask them, how do you interpret this? They say everything should be reported. So there's definitely confusion between what is supposed to be reported in Iceland, actually. And when it comes to large whales, of course, these are already less likely to be witnessed. So we already know it's being severely underreported. Even if they were all reported, it would only be a small fraction of how many large whales are being entangled, because oftentimes they're breaking free or they're carrying the gear away from them. So it's very difficult to estimate this type of thing. So the very last thing is just what can we do about this? So one is clarify those laws that I was talking about, but of course still then you have to monitor it. The other is the observer programs, which I mentioned before, but they can be very costly, and also you need sufficient coverage to have a proper estimate. And a very general model paper said that you need at least 20% covered to get an accurate estimate. And the cod gillnet fishery in Iceland, I think it was covered like 0.2% of the fishing effort. So it's not strong enough to really know what's going on. As was mentioned before, maybe we could have some sort of reporting app, and it might be simpler to be able to submit photos, videos, be able to select in pictures what you caught in your nets, and maybe that would simplify things. But the most simple thing is definitely the electronic monitoring. And I think that using cameras is something that has been piloted before. And I think it's something that would be really interesting to look more into, because the cameras, if you can get a trusting relationship with the fishers to be able to do this, which is kind of the basis of all of this, then the cameras kind of have the observer effect, which means that the fishers know that there's a possibility someone could check on them. So they're more likely to write down truly what happened. And then you could have where you just verified a subset of the footage each year, not go through all of it. And if it matched very closely with the logbook, then maybe it would be good to have some sort of incentive program that, you know, if your bycatch is correct, your reporting is correct, then maybe you're rewarded in some way. Whereas, of course, if it was found out that it was not correct, well, then you're not following the law, and then you're going to be fined for that. But of course, this is all very based on having a relationship with fishers and starting to try out all these different methods and hopefully work together for better bycatch management. Thank you. I can't see you.
Did I get it right that you're mostly assuming that they get entangled while the fishermen are fishing, so not as much just discarded fishing gear or floating fishing gear? Because I feel like obviously the fishermen or the fishers could report if it's entangled while they're fishing if they recognize that it is a bycatch or an entanglement, but how large do you think the percentage of entanglements or bycatches are? I mean, obviously not really bycatch, but entanglements leading to death just from fishing gear floating around.
Yeah, so the question was how much might be from not active fishing gear and like ghost gear or discarded gear just that got lost somewhere and then entangled a whale. Definitely that happens some for sure, but I don't remember the numbers, but this has been like studied in the US where they're trying to take the gear off the whales and then determine where it came from. And the vast majority of it was active gear, actually. So a lot of it is definitely happening in active fishing gear. But of course, there is still the issue, you sometimes put a gill net out for several days. So you're not there watching it all the time, which is what I meant about how, you know, even if they reported everything that they saw, it's still going to be like underestimated because of all the things that they just weren't there to witness.
Yep. For the underreporting in general, I guess this would be either what you personally think or what is known. For fishers not reporting it, do you think it's a combination or one of more than the other? Them possibly getting in trouble for reporting it, not really wanting to bother doing it, or that they're told by the companies themselves, please do not report when this happens because we'll have to change what we do.
Yeah, so the question was, if I think, why aren't the fishers reporting? Could it be that the company maybe says don't do it because it might change the fishing, or they're worried themselves about the consequences, or if they just can't be bothered? I would say from the fishers that I talk to, it's a combination more of them not really being bothered / not fully knowing, at least in Iceland, exactly what is supposed to be reported. When I went with the Capelin boat and was asking them questions like, does anybody ever ask you about this? Have you ever written this down? They just said like, no, nobody ever asked. And, you know, we thought it was optional and nobody ever writes in the optional column of the book. So I think it's definitely partially that they didn't really know / didn't really care that much to be bothered about it. And also, definitely people answered in the anonymous survey that they were worried about the consequences to the fishing industry. But nobody ever really said that they were told not to say that. But maybe that's also something that you wouldn't want to tell somebody also. So.
Can you tell, like, if there is like a whale, like a humpback whale with fresh entanglement scar on their tail, and if you see them like over and over again, like, can you see if they have a fresh scar, or do they have the scars after the nets, like for years?
Yeah, so the question was if you can see on the humpback whale scarring when they have a fresh scar, and if they have the scars for years or if they're changing. So I looked at gain and loss rates of entanglement scars a little bit, but in Skjaldfandi, one of the issues, or Iceland in general, is that you often don't see many of the same whales in consecutive years over and over again, which you would need to really try to follow it. But from what I had in consecutive years, there was very little loss. So they are keeping the scars for many years. But we also looked at raw injuries as a proxy for being entangled within 1 year. So they have studied that in the US, and they've determined that it takes roughly 1 year for the scars to heal white. Before that, they will be like this raw injury pink color. From those, then you can say, okay, this whale's been entangled roughly within the last year. And that's how we calculated the 2% of the population per year that had been entangled.
Hi, thanks, that was really good. I don't really know anything about observer programs. How do they choose when to have an observer on the boat? Is it completely randomized across space and time and company and vessel, or is there probably some sort of bias in that?
It depends on the country a lot. There's a lot of different types of observer programs. They are trying to randomize it as much as they can, of course. Like in the US, it's split into categories of like high probability of interaction, medium probability, and low probability. The low probabilities, they never get an observer. The high probabilities, then it's randomized throughout it. And if they say you have to take an observer, then you have to take an observer, any boat, anything. But in Norway, for example, they use a reference fleet. So actually, there's no observer there most of the time. They have a paid fleet that is reporting. So then, yeah, definitely there could be some biases in that now that you're paying vessels to do it.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you,
Charla.
Thank you.